section between humans and technology. My name is Guthrie. I'm here with Susan. Hey, Susan.
Hello.
I'm also here with Dean Barker. Hey, Dean.
Hello, Guthrie. Hello, Susan.
So today we are continuing our continuing series.
We're ending it though. We think this is going to be the last one.
Well, that's sad, but
the last episode
maybe.
of the series, not the whole podcast.
Well, yeah, maybe.
All right, we've been doing a series about objects and object-oriented design. And Dean, I think, based on what you told me a moment ago, what you want to do in the place you want to take off today is, where does object-oriented design fit in the overall UX design process?
Yeah, the process context. We talked a lot about history. We talked about the relationship to object-oriented programming, and we talked about the approach from a modeling standpoint and some of the technical design aspects of it in terms of analysis. But we haven't touched on how it fits with all the other things that we like to do from a design perspective.
Okay.
So I thought that would be
how are we going to tackle good thing to talk about. How are we going to tackle this?
Well, maybe top down. So my thinking was we could begin with a little bit of a general discussion about UX process, and then talk about some of the object-oriented methodologies that exist, and then maybe even dare we give some guidance and recommendations for how people should use these ideas going forward in their own work.
And you don't think that in itself is a 6-part series? I'm really fascinated here to see how this is going to go, because knowing you and I, and having gone through a discussion of UX process with you multiple times in our journeys together, and how long each of those took.
I think you guys should really start by starting at the beginning of the UCD process, and then sort of kind of walking through.
No, but I think before we do that, we should talk about a history of the UCD process.
Now wait, now I feel like you're mocking me.
No, it's like, I'm really interested in how this is going to unfold.
If you want a historical perspective, I did actually bring some key texts.
It's such a big topic. Okay. I'm with you, Dean. Go for it. I'm going to let you drive.
Okay. Oh, goodness. Yeah. So, the general idea is process. And if anybody is familiar with the Mythical Man Month, which is a project management book, the author was a fellow named Frederick Brooks. And he's got a great book that's not as nearly as well known. It's called The Design of Design. And so that concept of designing design process, I think, is really important. How do we do our design work? And it's not just a rhetorical question. It needs to be answered. And there is a distinction, much as there is in development, with what the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon, they make a distinction between team process and personal process. What I'm largely talking about is team process, right? With the assumption that most of what we do from a software product design perspective and a product design perspective is a team sport, right? So how do you do this work from that perspective? And there are process methodologies, frameworks that are published, that are proprietary. They're all over the place. And so as a perspective on that, I thought I would take kind of a representative sampling, and we can talk in general about these. Excuse me. So, Susan, I will start with one in particular, and that is the idea of design thinking. And we have our thoughts on design thinking, but the rough flow of it, depending on the source that you're looking at, is discover, define, develop, and deliver, right? And it involves a process of divergent and convergent thinking. Design thinking has a rich history. It has been, I think, in some ways oversold. It has been in some ways bastardized, but it's a big part of the literature and a big part of our design culture. And it's quite in the zeitgeist. It's kind of a big deal. So I thought maybe it would be something to start with. So maybe begin with your thoughts on design thinking.
Well, I just want to add briefly. I like design thinking as something to teach. In my opinion, compared to some of the other methodologies and stuff, it's pretty standardized. It certainly has there are little tidbits, but basically it's the same steps, but they just changed like the names of what you're calling, some of the steps in there. And I'm not saying that makes it easy to teach, but at least there seems to be some sort of like beginning and end, and then you can wrap it all up in a bow in some cases. And I would encourage, we should talk about it, but if you want to do a whole thing, I do believe we have podcast episodes that we have done about design thinking in the past, where we've kind of walked through, and there are obviously good places to learn about it as well. So just wanted to add that if people were start over.
It's so interesting. One of the classes I taught, Dean, you still are teaching college classes. I've taken a big pause and maybe stopped teaching college classes at this point, but I did for a couple of years as an adjunct instructor at University of Wisconsin. And one of the classes I taught in the UX program there was about design methodologies. I mean, that was I don't know the official name, but that's what it was. And I remember I reached out to you because I was like, help me figure out how to teach them Agile, because that's, your Agile UX, because that's your specialty. But it was a class I was dreading teaching, because it was like, oh my God, I got one semester and I'm going to teach, which methodologies am I going to teach them? And then how am I going to do this? And it actually ended up being one of my favorite classes that I taught. It was quite challenging, but I did design thinking. I did user-centered design, and I did Agile UX. I think those were the three and we walked through, and we designed stuff using those three methodologies.
Right.
And so that really brought home to me, the positive aspects of those particular methodologies, the negative aspects of the methodologies, and I knew this before, but it was just kind of shining a spotlight on the different methodologies. And so, yeah, I mean, I have taught a semester-long course on design thinking, just by itself, and I've taught, corporate workshops on design thinking. So, yeah, I my take on design thinking. What was the question? What's the question?
Well, trying to explain design thinking, I think, and Guthrie, I think your interpretation of, it's pretty well standardized. I think it's well standardized in the abstract, right? So is it the idea of grokking a thing, I think, is a Kurt Vonnegut idea. But I think most people, at least in the field, and many in business, kind of grok the general idea of design thinking. But for example, if you look at the process, right? So we're talking about process. I'm quoting from the book of Robert Curedale, Design Thinking, Process and Methods, 5th edition, and the process flow and the double diamond version that he has, which is adopted from the double diamond that most people think of, which was published by the British Design Council in 2005. The stages are discover, define, develop, deliver. Those are actually referred to as activities. The phases. So what's the difference between an activity and a phase? That's an interesting discussion. The way they're depicted here, they're both kind of at the top level of a visualization. But the author has listed engage, synthesis, ideation, and implement. And if you go to kind of the roots of the thing, this all came out of, by the way, I'm not going to do a whole historical deep dive into design thinking. I'm happy to come back and do that because I've done that research, believe it or not. But this all goes back to a fellow named John Arnold from a course he taught at Stanford, I think in the mid 50s. I'll have to double check the reference, but it was called creative engineering. And anyway, and the process evolved there. But Stanford was sort of the cradle of civilization for design thinking. And if you look at the way that Stanford at least currently describes it, they publish a PDF process guide, and they have a slightly different process. Kind of to your point, Guthrie, like, they use different terms. It all roughly comes out to be the same thing. But theirs is empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test, right? And so I would argue that for the most part, all of these processes are, in engineering processes as well, are some sort of manifestation of the OODA loop or the Shewhart cycle, plan, do, check, act, right? Like there's some natural flow to all these things in the process of creating and engineering. But the steps themselves, the activities, the things you do in them, even the philosophy, right? So Susan, you mentioned the idea of user-centered design as kind of an era of process that we lived through and did a lot of work together defining process in. And that was very intentionally human-centered, specifically user-centered. As much as the design thinking literature includes human-centered as an idea, one of its faults, I think, is it's not sufficiently human-centered. And if you go back and you look at the history of it, indeed, the whole idea of creative engineering, the idea was to unleash the creativity of the designers, of the engineers. It was human-centered with a focus on the designer, not human-centered with a focus on the user per se. Now, there's activities in there in terms of building empathy and whatnot, but that's very different from then the what I'll call the usability-centered methodologies that were called human or user-centered design, like throughout the 90s and early 2000s, right? So if you go back and you look at a publication like Deborah Mayhew's Usability Engineering Lifecycle, it's a thick book, lots and lots of steps. It was all about making sure that things that you create are usable, and it was very human-centered from a productivity standpoint primarily, less about empathy and emotion. And I think that's one thing that design thinking has right, and that whole sort of creative school has right, is the more of the effective consideration. But it's not very robust, right? It's not robust, and it ends at prototyping. It does not go through implementation. So it is not a methodology that is suitable for actually building products, which ultimately, as Steve Jobs ostensibly famously said one time, real artists ship, right? And that's what we would want to do, is we want to ship products. So anyway, but it's out there, and it's a big deal, and something that your listeners ought to be very familiar with.
Yeah, I agree. I think you need to know about it. You need to understand the useful aspects of it, but it is not, if that was all you knew, I know you're not going to be able to design products that are optimized for particular target audiences.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
Yeah, and that, that
which I
has
think the object-oriented design will do for you.
Because I think, and we would probably agree on this, because of the importance of aligning what you're designing to a user mental model. It's that alignment between a designer's
it's a
model
level.
and a
It's a level of detail of process.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because I might have talked about this already, but whenever Guthrie and I are teaching object-oriented design in a workshop, which we do, the first thing I will say right up front is, this is the hardest thing I teach. This is the toughest thing to learn. It is detailed and it is abstract at the same time, and it's conceptual, and it's very process driven, and it's not going to be easy. So strap yourself in.
Yeah, people don't do well with conceptual stuff.
And I just, and and I want to warn them because I'm trying to engage. Do you know about Connor Demon Yaman?
No, I don't
There's a
even think I could
name.
say it. Yeah.
There's a name. Connor Demon Yaman. He's an interesting cognitive psychologist guy who, in addition to having, I think, a PhD and doing research and the kind of stuff we like, also was on an early reality TV show and became a big star on it. So he has
Okay.
this weird background. Anyway, he talks about fluency and disfluency. And he talks about the idea that if you think something is easy, if you think something's going to be easy to learn, which is what he's calling fluency, you actually don't pay that much attention to it. And so you don't learn it particularly well. And if you think something is going to be hard, then you're like, oh boy, this is going to be tough. I'd better really I mean, a lot of this happening unconsciously. I'd better really pay attention. You actually learn it better. So that's why when we start teaching this stuff on object-oriented design and conceptual modeling, I just tell people, get ready.
Yeah.
This is tough. I do it on purpose.
Well,
I don't know if it helps or not, but I don't want them to think this is easy.
Now you're making me think maybe we'll need another episode. But
stop.
16 more.
cross that Rubicon.
All right, so keep going. I won't interrupt you too much.
Yeah, so design thinking is kind of, think of it as one school of thought, right?
Yes.
Like at one point in our conversation, I forget when, but I introduced this idea of communities of practice, right? And we sort of used it for this juxtaposition between designers and developers and the Mars Venus sort of paradigm.
Yeah.
But within the design community, design with a capital D, right? Human factors, user experience, interaction design, visual design. You talk about these process methodologies like design thinking. There are tribes, right? There are sub-communities within that. And I think kind of the contemporary manifestation of how I came up, and I think where you were oriented, for example, when you wrote your GUI Design Essentials book and some of the early work that we did, was what I would call user-centered or human-centered design processes.
Yeah.
There is a book, Hartson and Pila are the authors. It's called the UX book. It's quite a tome. I've taught from it for one semester university courses. And they have what they call their wheel. It's their process. Everybody's got their version of this intellectual property, even though it's roughly the same thing. And their flow, again, kind of a two-tiered flow, goes from design solutions, prototype candidates. Starts with understand needs, then design solutions, then prototype candidates, then evaluate UX. And so the sub text for each one of those stages or phases, I don't know if they're explicit about it. That whole meta conversation is something else maybe we can get into. But their 4 steps are then following that flow: understand user work and needs, create design concepts, realize design alternatives, and verify and refine designs. And it's a fine methodology. There's nothing wrong with it. That's a pretty high level of abstraction. There are, more details under that, but that really maps to, if you go all the way back to the ISO standard for human-centered design. I spent 7 years as part of ISO as a technical expert working on international standards. And one of the standards that existed before I got involved was, I think, 9241 was the human-centered design process. And that is very similar to what the Hartson text has. You plan the process, you understand the user and their context, specify requirements. The R word is interesting to come back to. Produce design solutions to meet requirements, and then evaluate against the requirements. And that gets to the whole sort of software testing idea of validation versus verification. And that's like a whole rat hole that we could go down. But the point is that there are these human-centered, user-centered, software-centric, indeed, processes that exist and have existed for a long time that I think represent a process definition that comes from a slightly different tribe than the design thinking community, right? They're not incompatible, but they're different processes. And then there are more idiosyncratic processes as well. And, as I pull up my stack of books as I do for these discussions. A couple of them that I pulled from the shelf. One was Karen Holtzblatt's Contextual Design. She's got another, she and her co-author Hugh Beyer have another version of that called Rapid Contextual Design, which is the one I typically use when I'm teaching this stuff or actually doing it for projects. And when I was working at a commercial software company for a few years, over a decade ago, brought Karen in to teach her methodology to my whole team. So it was really interesting working directly with her and getting that experience. And one of the things that's interesting, two things about her methodology, not dissimilar from design thinking, doesn't necessarily go through implementation. It's kind of prototyping centric, but it is not just paying lip service to empathy. Her whole thing about contextual design is going out into the wild and doing field studies, doing ethnographic studies, gathering lots of rich qualitative data. So in that sense, it's precisely on point, particularly with upstream, early product development activities that you want to do. But then she has very formal approaches to the modeling of a system
Right.
from an analysis and design standpoint based on that rich qualitative data. And her methodology is down to like, you use this color of sticky note for this level of information, right? It's very precise, which is great. And so what I like about contextual design, in addition to the true human-centeredness, is the modeling aspect of it, and explicitly talking about modeling in a way that, frankly, good software engineering talks about modeling. I'm a big proponent of Scott Ambler and this approach to agile modeling from a technical standpoint. And so, that's an idiosyncratic method, right? That's her process. She's got it documented in a couple of books, written plenty of papers, and given presentations about it. It's not sort of more of a generic method like the design thinking. And even design thinking, there's the Stanford version and the IDEO version and the version from the book I was quoting before and whatnot. And there are other idiosyncratic processes as well. Like one of the other books that I grabbed just because it's interesting is the Sprint book, Jake Knapp, Google Ventures guy. And that is it's a variation of design thinking, but it's basically take a week and go through the design thinking process. And that is a flow of map, sketch, decide, prototype, and test, right? So you can see they're all roughly the same, but there are differences that make a difference. Even in the Holtzblatt and the contextual design, as robust as the modeling is, it's very centered on task analysis, but it does not explicitly include object analysis, which is where I wanted to go next. So, So, do you want to talk about object analysis? I have a couple of oldies but goodies here in my hand. What do I
He's
got?
holding two goodies from the past. So Dean just held up, if you're listening and not watching, he held up a book he and I wrote together called Designing Speech Interfaces from a long time ago. Let's just say that. And also, and in there we actually talked about, design process in general, and not just about for speech interfaces. And then he was also holding up something called Interphase 5, which was my version, our version of UX process, user-centered design process, that I taught for years and years and years in the workshops I taught. And we're going to revive it, right, Guthrie? We're going to bring it back and modernize it.
That's the plan. It's all ready to go. It's just a matter of actually wanting to do it.
Yeah, because interestingly, I haven't changed. I'm doing the same thing. I mean, it friggin' works. So it just needs to be updated with, some more modern terminology and examples.
And the examples, I was looking at in the Interphase 5 book. God. That is my hand drawn, like with my little mechanical drafting table, and
I had
my little protractor that I used to use, and it's just
Doing
funny
a
to
little
dust this off.
hand-drawn prototype of
Hand-drawn
a
prototype.
Windows screen.
That's right. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
But the thing that we did, so we both had a history of process engineering and process development, and I've done a lot of that in software process in addition to design process. And so there was sort of the meta level of talking about, well, how do you structure the process, right? And at the highest level, are there phases, stages? What do we call those
yeah,
things, right?
yep,
What's
yep,
under that? Activities, sub-activities,
yeah,
steps. And that stuff isn't just semantics, right? Particularly if you're going to teach that, if you're going to deploy it
yep,
in an organization where people need to know how to use it, you have to have that rigor of definition. And so we won't turn this into a meta discussion, but there is that aspect of it. But one of the things that we did was we took all of these best practices that existed in the industry, the stuff on the contextual inquiry and building empathy and doing qualitative research up front, all of the goodness from task analysis that's in the core literature of that era and beyond, and carried it all the way through implementation. But we explicitly included in both of those methodologies object analysis, right? That was a
yeah. That was a
core activity,
critical
right?
part. Yep. It's so interesting too. This whole series has made me think, and you're bringing up that my remembering of teaching. I had a 4-day class, which I was basically teaching the Interface 5 process. It makes me realize that there's a level of rigor to design that I have found really hard to hold on to in the world. It's like people don't want to do it. They just don't want. It's a lot of work. And they just don't want to do it. And they just want to go off. And, I was thinking the other day, Dean, I was in some meetings with a client, and I was just thinking about what's missing and what do they need to do and what's different. And it dawned on me that they were this team was designing screens. Like they were designing screens and with features. There was features and functionalities, and the UX team was designing screens, but they weren't tying that to task flow and task analysis.
Right.
And so, it was like, okay, wait a minute. We shouldn't be designing screens. That's not what we're designing. Like, why are we designing screens? We're designing a user's experience through a task. It happens to be manifesting in some screens, but the focus is wrong here, guys. But it is a lot of work. It is a lot of work, and people don't want to do the work, and they don't want to take the time. That's what I think. And then they get all caught up in the prototyping tool, and they jump to details about visual design and details about interaction way too soon. But it's just not. My concern, Dean, with the whole object-oriented design is that most people don't think it's fun. You and I think it's fun. But I think
we're warped that way, but
most people don't think it's fun. And so it's really easy to just not do it. It's like hard work and it's not fun. I'm not doing it.
I think it's really interesting what you're talking about, and even how to frame that. So I'll frame it as robustness of process, right? How robust is your process? And in the software engineering world, you will talk about heavyweight versus lightweight processes. And there was a perception, for example, that the classical waterfall technique was heavyweight, and there were a bunch of problems with that. So I think that there are two things driving the state of affairs that you describe. One is education. How are people being taught? What are they being taught?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's, under the
Yeah.
poor assumption that they're actually even being taught and coming out of
Yeah.
programs that teach these kinds of things, like the university courses that you and I teach. Most practitioners don't.
Are
It's
not
an
getting that.
interdisciplinary field. They're coming from all manner of backgrounds, and that's fine, right? Like that's good. That sort of
Yeah. Well, and
diversity
also
is good.
even if they're getting a specific degree in human, in HCI, right? Human computer interaction. I don't think most schools are teaching an object oriented approach.
No, most
So
schools are
nobody's
right.
getting it.
Right, right.
It's not being taught.
Yeah, and
I mean,
they're barely getting sort of the basic rigor of design thinking or UCD HCD
yeah,
process.
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
So anyway, all right,
So-
let's move on.
Oh.
Yeah, this was good. So I do, there is a robustness. If you're going to do object oriented design, you are going to do a robust design process.
Well, maybe.
I
Like
think
that's an interesting discussion. So I want to finish the bite on this robustness, because I think the other
Okay.
issue that's driving the state that you described, and I think that's accurate, is not just education, but it's the process context that we work in.
Yeah.
Right. So I mentioned waterfall, and for forever that was sort of the way of working, and then the agile movement just caught on like wildfire, and that really started to proliferate process thinking. There was a time, I don't know,
Yeah.
probably in the early mid 90s, where we had kind of a leg in each camp. I remember I was consulting at the time. I had 2 half-time contracts. It's back when I was doing research and design and not management. And I spent literally half my day in a RUP process for an insurance company, the Rational Unified Process, which is
Yep.
very heavyweight, very object-friendly
Process,
way of thinking.
Right, robust. Yep.
And then I spent half my day for a retail company. We were creating a point of sale system, and we were using XP, Extreme Programming, which had just come out, and was one of the early agile methodologies that was documented. And there were a couple of books that Kent Beck wrote on it. And I remember reading those books and thinking, what the hell is this? Like, how am I going to make this work for the stuff that I want to do? Right. And so I think that process context, we're talking about software development, software products, but that process context and the shift to agile took away some of the scaffolding that we would hang our bits onto for the work.
Exactly.
It took away robust requirements as a stage. It took away analysis as a stage. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing, because there are obvious benefits to agile ways of working. However, it makes it more difficult for us to figure out some of the best practices from a design standpoint, and literally where they fit logistically into software process.
Yep. Exactly. So now what do we do?
Well, let's pivot to some of the stuff that's not ours.
What does that mean?
Oh, do you really want to do that?
I want an homage. I have
Fine.
geez, the stack just crumbled. The stack of books just fell over.
For those listening, the table that Dean had a mountain of books on has collapsed,
No, it
and
hasn't.
the poor wooden legs are strewn across the floor under the
You
weight of
just
the
knocked
tomes.
over a couple of books.
That's
No,
right.
I don't think that's true.
All right. So we have been very clear. We didn't invent this technique, and it really came out of a school of thought at IBM, and kind of I think of if you only had one book to get, it's of course long out of print, but there's one that IBM published called Designing for the User with Ovid. And Ovid is I wonder if they pronounce it Ovid or Ovid. I think it's Ovid.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But it's Object View Interaction Design. And it was an IBM publication. Robert Sperry, Isensi, and Mullally. Scott Isensi, one of the other authors, he and somebody else, I forget who, wrote a great book. I think it was called The Art of Rapid Prototyping. But it's
I
great
actually
prototyping book.
know him.
Oh, really? You know Scott?
Yeah. I've had personal conversations. Yeah.
That's cool. I am a fanboy. I
Yeah.
like his work quite a bit. And so Ovid is an object-centered design process. So here's the
Right.
distinction I want to make. There are processes like the contextual design process, like the ISO human-centered design process, like design thinking, like design sprint, like lean UX. These things are public. They're available. You can learn them. And they're all good processes. Although, take them all with a grain of salt and your mileage may vary, right? Like you need to tailor any process for a given context. But those do not have object analysis as part of their workflow.
Correct.
The processes that we created for Interface 5 and for our first book together, those explicitly included object analysis in it. The Ovid methodology includes object analysis in it. It's not just a technique. It is a core part of the process, right? So that's the distinction.
Right.
And so their development process activities, I should look at my notes here. Their development activities are requirements analysis, modeling, design, prototyping, evaluation, and implementation. Those are the phases, stages, steps, however you want to think of it in the process. And so modeling, you circle that object modeling that we describe and talk about is a core part of the object flow. But even that in IBM, wasn't the only game in town. I used to work at, I spent 4 years as a consultant at American Express. So I was never a direct employee, but I was there basically full time for nearly 4 years. And in one of the design groups that I was supporting there, I'm not even sure how they came to use this methodology, but there was a methodology they used called the bridge. And there was a fellow named Tom Dayton who was at Belcor, and he was doing all of the CHI and UPA, now UXPA conferences and all of that, promoting his methodology. And I had seen him at some of the conferences, smart guy. And that, I remember learning it from a binder they must have gotten from training that they had used. But there is a version of that in a publication called User Interface Design, Bridging the Gap from User Requirements to Design. Great subtitle. That's an edited volume, and there's a chapter that Dayton and I think a co-author wrote, and it describes the bridge methodology, which is a, quote, comprehensive and integrated methodology for quickly designing object-oriented, multi-platform graphical user interfaces that definitely meet user needs. I don't know about the definitely, but it's a good description. And that methodology is similar. The explicit steps are similar to the Ovid methodology with a heavy orientation, not just on object modeling, but on deriving object models from task models. And I'll pause there because I know you've got thoughts and feelings on that. I want to touch on a couple of other methodologies that exist just for context and awareness. But I think this issue between object modeling and task modeling is really important. So Susan, maybe you.
All this stuff was going on around the same time, right? And it's great work that, in my opinion, stands the test of time. So I think that object modeling is really useful for interface design. And I think because we are, if you are user oriented and user experience oriented, then the best object model to use is one that is a blend of object modeling and task analysis, so that you are deriving your objects from a robust analysis of how people want to do that particular task. And if you do it that way, then not only do you have a great place to, a great bridge, as Dayton said,
Yeah.
For moving from, conceptual ideas to, okay, so how do we design the interactions then? Right? That's your bridge.
Right.
That's why you need that. But then you can be sure that the interaction design that you create from your object model will be usable, will meet user needs, because you did the task analysis part first, and then you derived your object model from that, and then you design your screens from that. And it's I remember when I first started teaching this, and I think that maybe the first time I ever taught this might have been, I had been speaking about it, but I think the first time I put a workshop together might have been in Minneapolis, Dean, at Cargill Corporation.
Ah.
And it was to a bunch of programmers and, analysts. It wasn't UX people, because there were no UX, very few UX people in the world at that point.
Right.
So, the people who you taught these workshops to was programmers. And I put it that way to them. I said, this is, you've got all this kind of analysis stuff that you do, and then you got to somehow get to creating a screen. This is the bridge. This
That's
is
right.
the thing that will get you from point A to point B. And it was interesting. And actually, in that workshop, I did two things. The first thing I did was I gave them a setup and a situation and the users, and I said, okay, design screens. They had everything supposedly they needed to design a screen. And, they sat there and they thought about it, and they literally drew a box, and then started talking about, what are we going to put on the screen? And it took them a really long time to do it.
Right,
and the results were like, and everybody had a totally different design. So then I said, okay, now here's a different scenario, different type of application, different users here. And I gave them the, end of the object model point, right? Because if you do this right, if you do this bridge, you end up with, a screen flow navigate. I gave them that and said, now design the screen. And then they were just like, they designed it quickly and easily. And it was like, okay, what was the difference? So they kind of realized before we even started teaching what that was and how we got there. They realized that, if I've actually got all this stuff, then the design of the screens is a lot easier, and I know what to design. So it is a bridge. I think it absolutely is a bridge between, what your initial analysis of what you should be designing, and then how do I get there? How do I get to the screens? Yeah, no, it's so powerful, and it makes me sad that I guess it makes me really rethink Guthrie, what the work that we're doing and the workshops that we're teaching. And the interesting thing is, nobody will ask us to teach them this. It's like, let's wait and see if people will ask us to teach them this. They won't, because they don't know about it, and they don't know how powerful it is, and it's hard to explain. Actually, interestingly, and maybe we should go back to this, because the way that I used to do a lot of it was I just called it the secrets of intuitive design.
Right.
And then everybody wanted to know what that was. If I said I'm going to teach you object view modeling,
Right.
nobody
No.
wanted that. But if I said I'm going to teach the secrets of intuitive design, it was like, oh, I want to know what that is. So I think we may have to go back to that.
Yeah, I think the trouble is that people want a shortcut. It's if you've got any sort of regular relationship with social media, you see these streams that are all, whether it's health hacks or investing hacks or, get rich quick things.
Well, we'll just call it design hacks. Let's
Yeah,
just
it's
call
a
it
design.
that.
It's a design. It's all marketing. But the thing that the robustness question, right? All this upfront
Yeah.
work, just like you were
Nobody wants to
describing
do
in
it.
your
I know.
you were describing in your example there. Nobody wants to do the upfront work. I'm sitting here in my music studio, and I have a whole kind of second career in that arena. And from a composition standpoint, and I was university trained and have studied with great composers and arrangers over the years. One of the common practices and something that I do is to develop a framework for a composition before you write a note, right? You will sit down and you will imagine, you will hear in your imagination ideas, a motif, whatever that you'll capture, and the structure that you put together literally in a diagram, right, is then that framework that you use to drive your actual composing. And from that structure, then you can start with harmony, you can start with melody, you can start with rhythm, whatnot. But you go through and you imagine the orchestration and the structure. And I'm going to go from this to a solo section, to an ensemble section, to the bridge, to then a recapitulation, and you write that down. Right. And so this upfront work before you do the detail work, it's exactly the same as you don't start in a sprint on sprint 1, day 1, drawing screens, right? Like that's not how this works if you want any kind of quality. And yet that's what most people do. And if you look at the process context from a software standpoint, plenty of software methodologies preceded these agile methodologies. And the agile methodologies tried to take this notion of incremental and iterative, right, as two attributes of their methodology. Everybody gets the incremental part, which is, you build a little bit, you build a little bit more, you build a little bit more, and you keep tacking on that. Nobody gets iteration. Nobody wants to actually iterate. The secret sauce or the secrets of intuitive design include the object-oriented paradigm, but also just plain old hard work of iteration. Right? Like you have to iterate your way to quality designs, and that's hard to do. The Agile has promised that, it's the promise is it's just software. So unlike architecture, if we build something we don't like, we can change it. Nobody has the intellectual honesty on a routine basis to change and refactor things. Right. And that's a major problem in the industry. It's this push towards feature, which then introduces another problem from a UX perspective, which is feature bloat, which is rampant, right? And so these are deep systemic problems in our industry, really. Glad I could cheer you up.
You're gonna solve it today? I don't think so.
All right. So did we answer the question of where this fits?
Well, we can start to address that. I think it's twofold, right? One is there are these methodologies, and I've described some. There's another. I'll hold up some books for anybody who's watching. There's a book called Object Modeling and User Interface Design. Mark von Harmelin is the editor of that, and he has I think this is the Idiom one. I love that. Yeah, he's got an object-oriented methodology he calls Idiom. I love the name. That's documented in that book. That may or may not be out of print. This one is still in print. This might be a great starting point for folks who are interested. And it is a book by Dave Collins, Designing Object-Oriented User Interfaces. Collins was another IBMer, right? A lot of this stuff comes out of IBM. And he has what he calls the OOUI design process, which again is very heavy on that relationship between object and task analysis.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
So the question of where it fits, I think, is it depends. and it's twofold. One is it fits right in the middle, in the core, as a key core, not optional step in the process, right?
Yep.
It is a key component to your methodology. And so if you are creating a design methodology, a design process, one of the things to consider is the extent to which, from a philosophical standpoint, you believe in object orientation and you want to include that as a core activity. In that case, it's got to be there, and it's a required activity, phase, step, stage, whatever you want to call it.
Yep.
That's one scenario. Another scenario, and I would say then, if that is the case, then what you're talking about is a prescriptive methodology in a team context where you're saying to a design team, an engineering team that partners with them, this is how we're going to do this stuff.
Yep.
And objects are in the middle of the workflow, and so we're going to rally around that, and that's just going to be part of how we do this cooperative work. It's there as a team. If that is not the case, and you believe philosophically in the value and the merit of this approach, then I think as a personal or individual process, you squeeze it in as a technique rather than part of a process framework, but it's a technique for your personal process that you just do. Maybe you do it as a team. Maybe you can get some dispensation for that. Maybe you do it as a subgroup. But for example, as I've progressed in my career and gone into the executive ranks and had more of my life be about budgets and spreadsheets and things like that, as opposed to drawing screens, there's not a lot of occasion for me to kind of roll my sleeves up with that sort of thing. But on occasion it happens, whether it's something I have keen interest in or there's a need or whatever. And I have always reverted back to, even on an individual basis, I need to understand, as a designer, I need to understand the task and workflow. I need to create even a crude object model for me to get my head around how I'm going to do this. This is why I'm a big proponent of Scott Ambler's agile modeling, which has nothing to do with UX. That's a software engineering thing, but it's basically, look, you don't need UML, you don't need all these fancy tools, you don't need pixel perfect designs of your models. What you need is to spend a few hours doing the modeling activity, sloppily draw it on a whiteboard and take a picture of it. That's good enough. Right. And so I do the UX equivalent of that. So I think the place for it is different if you're talking about team process versus personal process. And if it's personal process, then you do it lightweight, you squeeze it in, but that's better than not doing it. Some is better than none.
Okay. You might be able to talk me into that. I think either way, though, where it goes, right? Where it goes is, it's probably, let's see, before you start creating screens.
Absolutely. Without
whatever that is. If you're prototyping, if you're hand drawing, if you're in Figma, whatever, before you start drawing screens, that's where it fits.
Yeah, and there's the distinction between a new product and an existing product. If you're redesigning an existing product, there are screens that exist. You can actually reverse engineer very quickly.
That's right.
An object model. But if you're designing a new product from scratch, then you have to have research and analysis that informs that model.
That's right. Right. Yeah. It's, and I do think basically I would say, for if people are interested in trying any of this, I mean, first of all, I think some of those books that you mentioned are good and really useful. But basically, I would say, look, to start, maybe I should ask you that, Dean. Let's say I'm an interaction designer. I don't know about this object-oriented stuff. I've never done it that way. I'm interested in this. I think it might be useful. It's not part of the formal process that is followed in wherever it is I work. How do I get started? I mean, I have some ideas about that, but what would you say?
Uh, well, now that I'm back in consulting, I would always say it depends, right? But one of the big things is, as an Australian friend of mine said, you need some thinking time, mate. Like, you need some thinking time. We cannot solve these types of problems thinking through a problem space, thinking through a solution space, thinking through the analysis. You're not going to arrive at a good conclusion in 30 minutes in between a boss meeting and a HR meeting or something, right? Like this work life that we have where you're bouncing from meeting to meeting and you don't get deep thinking time. I think it's the Aaron Dignan deep work idea, right? I think that's the author of that book. It's deep work. And so it requires thinking time. So if you want to start someplace, the very first thing, even bereft of any research analysis, prior modeling, data, tasks, anything, is based on what you know, sit down for a few hours. And I think pen and pencil and paper, right? Like, get away from the digital environment. You can look stuff up, but start to sketch. Big proponent of sketching, modeling, just talking boxes and arrows stuff. This is not art school, right? And start to explore, go through some exploratory work of capturing your own understanding of a system. Now, that will be a better and more true or accurate activity if you go into that armed with user research, task analysis, a set of requirements, even user stories. If you're in a redesign, like I say, some sort of reverse engineering of an existing system, some sort of domain model, entity relationship model, something, class diagram, you can gather these inputs, right? So there's kind of three, good, better, best. It's good to just sit down and start thinking about it. It's better to have inputs to that thinking time. And the best thing is to do the generative activities of research and analysis to inform that model. And one of the things that I think it was your GUI Design Essentials book, and I'm not sure the origin of this, but I believe that's where I picked up this idea of explicitly defining in design informing artifacts and designs themselves, current state versus future state. And in this modeling, you joke about the muddle, right? Like, how we muddle our way through things. In these analysis and modeling activities, I cannot tell you how many times I've seen people get wrapped around the axle rather, and they are conflating current state and future state. And I've had to step in and say, hey, look, are you drawing a model about the way things are, or the way you want things to be, right? So just that alone, like, do a current state model. Now think about the problems and opportunities that exist. How are we going to improve the future state that we're designing the future? Now draw up the future state model. Just being clear about that, and whiteboard, rough drawing, take a picture, share that with the team. Boy, that sort of lightweight approach, because of the clarity that it brings in the thinking around what we're collectively doing, is it's worth its weight in gold.
Yeah. Yep. So wrapping up the series.
Dun, dun, dun.
I mean, I do want to make Guthrie, am I allowed to make a plug?
You can do anything you want.
So, I mean, I just professionally, Guthrie and I are thinking about, next steps for us and what we want to work on next. And Dean, you've talked to Guthrie and I about this whole object-oriented thing. What do we want to do with it? How much do we want to revive it? So maybe there'll be some new stuff coming out from our collective work. But I do want to mention that we have 2 courses, online video courses that exist that people can take, that are that are exactly about this. One is our course on user research that takes you through the scenarios and the task analysis and the current task analysis and the future task analysis, and that whole thing, right? That's all in there. And then the next course, which is on conceptual models. And guess what that covers? How to come up with objects and views and what to do with it. So, I mean, this stuff, if you want to learn more, Guthrie, this is our plug. We have these 2 online courses. Go to our website, which is
The teamw.com.
Yep, and click on courses, and then
Or
look
go to
for
courses.theteamw.com is the other way to do it.
and look for the 2 one course on user research, one course on conceptual models, and that will teach you how to do this. So that's one avenue if you're interested in learning more. And then maybe there will be Dean, from you and me and Guthrie, some new stuff that we might put together to help revive all this. But I really encourage, if you're interested at all in this, I encourage you to check it out. If you're designing, if you're doing UX work, and if you're designing anything that is moderately to severely complex.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. We're not talking about necessarily the website for your aunt's craft store that she's put together. Okay.
Auntie's Crafts.
You could use it for that.
You could.
But if we're talking about you're designing anything that is fairly complex, object modeling, object-oriented design is absolutely the way to go.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I had an early mentor prior to working with you first, who used to always say, simplify to clarify. And I think that the idea of an object model and the way it simplifies our conceptual understanding of the system and empowers you to make design decisions based on it is, again, just worth its weight in gold. So it's a worthwhile activity, and certainly worthy of listening to 6 podcast episodes.
Well, if they've listened to all of them, then maybe they either are ready to learn more or ready to move on. I don't know which it is. Dean, thank you so much for the series. It's been really fun recording this with you, and I really appreciate your time.
Oh, I appreciate you guys. Love you guys. Thank you so much. It's just always delightful to talk shop, and hopefully we shared some stuff with people that they'll be interested and get something out of it and help design a better world for people, because that's all we're trying to do, is just make the world a little bit better for human beings.
Guthrie, if people want to reach us, how do they do that?
You can email info@theteamw.com.
Thanks. Hey, thanks, guys. Thanks for the series.
Woo!
Bye.
Bye.